Hello, everyone. I'm John Vervaeke. I'm with two people that many of you probably know if you're familiar with my work at all. Both of them very good friends of mine, partners in Dialogos, very much reflectors upon the meaning crisis and the meta crisis we face. And I'm talking about Jordan Hall and Christopher Mastropietro. So first of all, welcome to both of you.
Nice. It's been a little bit too long, so it's good to see y'all again.
Yeah. So we're here on behalf of Sunday Labs. Chris and I belong to Sunday Labs, and Jordan is an advisor. I think that's a fair way to put it for the Sunday Labs project. We'll get a little bit more into that. But what I'd like to do is pick up on a proposal that Jordan has made, a sort of a 3-point proposal of the key response to the possible advent of AGI by the project that Sunday Labs is engaged in. And so I don't want to start articulating what it is because I want to concentrate on the proposal and then do the reverse of articulating the Sunday Lab project as a way of implementing and putting into practice the proposal. So that's how we're going to do it. So I'll start with a brief schematic presentation of what I think those 3 points are, and then I'll ask Jordan to refine it, challenge if I've misinterpreted. I'll ask Chris to give some initial reflections, and then we're going to try and amplify it, try and maybe what's missing or what needs to be readjusted, try to get into a very natural process about this. And along the way, we will no doubt mention specifics of the Sunday Lab company and the Sunday Lab project. And what I want to say one thing about that before I turn to this the schematic overview of Jordan's points. The proposal coming from Sunday Labs is equally a proposal about, technology, both what you might call the hardware and the software, and a proposal about a new type of company, a new way of framing a business enterprise's relationship to technology, and especially AI. So it's important that we're trying to articulate the full vision here, not just the tech, but there's tech, and then there's a new orientation around it and a more comprehensive philosophical framework. And so just want to make everybody very clear about that. So if you're watching this because you want sort of tech specifics, this is not what this is about. There's lots on the website about the tech specifics. Okay, we understand our responsibility to provide that. We're not dodging it. It's there, but this is not what that is about. That is not what this is about. Okay, we're trying to talk about something more comprehensive here and how it specifically addresses AGI. There's other ways in which the project addresses other major concerns, and hopefully we might touch on those as well, like issues around meaning, especially issues around privacy and the nature of selfhood and things like that. But let's get into it. And so, not that long ago, although it seems like forever, because I've been super busy. I've been traveling. Chris has been traveling, and Jordan's been traveling, and we almost intersected. I think by he was leaving the UK, as I was getting there, and stuff like that. But Jordan presented in a discussion sort of 3 points about what the project is. And the basic idea behind the project, very abstractly, and as I said, we'll get into the concretes, is the first is a way of addressing what's called the alignment problem. The alignment problem is basically if we are going to create sort of super AGI, and there's lots of questions and problems, and many of you know I have criticisms of just giving a blanket yes to that proposal. But there's something happening. Even if it's not genuine AGI, it's still powerful and it's going to be deeply disruptive. So let's take that as sort of an uncontested thing. The alignment problem is, how do we let this potentially world-changing technology emerge in a way that still aligns with our values, our vision, our virtues, aligns with human flourishing? And the reason why this is an issue is our typical kinds of responses Legislation don't work. Legislation doesn't work because it's always way too late and behind the times and obsolete by the time it rolls in. I'm not saying we shouldn't do some legislation, but if we're relying on that to be the thing that solves this problem, it's not sufficient to do it. The second is the misconception of the kind of technology at work. Well, we'll just program it so that it doesn't ever turn against us, as if it's some sort of 1970s von Neumann computer or something like that. That's not what these entities are. They're very weird entities, and some people are arguing philosophically, I think, meaning that they're sort of a new ontological category. They're sort of between tools and agents, and they're kind of like people, but they're not. And they're kind of like animals, but they're not. And so they don't fall cleanly into any of our categories. They see, and to be provocative, they seem a little bit like the ancient gods, but they're not. And so this is very problematic. And so that those two standard responses don't work. The sort of, well, let's just stop. Why can't we all stop? We're in the midst of a tsunami of a tragedy of the commons, which I think is so powerful that believing that we could just stop this project, I think, is quixotic. So Jordan said, well, what I see Sunday Labs doing, both in the new tech and the new vision and even how people are showing up and trying to enact it, is you're trying to get individual AI that is attuning to individuals and Jordan used the term at the level of their ensoulment, which I like, although he might have some theological dimensions to that I'm not quite sure if I share, but I get it that what you're doing is what Sunday Labs does is the machinery picks up on your individual biometrics because it uses all the camera sensors, your social metrics, how you're interacting, you're texting, your psychometrics. These can be picked up from a lot of things. And what it does is it has a way of guaranteeing the absolute privacy of that information and then feeding it back and making this AI personally attuned to you, to your rhythms and the patterns and the manner of your attunement. A lot of aspects that are not well captured in sort of objective descriptions of your behavior. These are indicators of the more ineffable parts of what it is to be a human being. And so you attune to that. And then this gets to the second point. You don't have a central, monolithic, global, large language model, AGI. What you have is a lot of distributed ones that are individualized because of the attunement, the first point. And they will distribute the power and the responsibility, and they act as, a collective intelligence that does checks and balances and is much more self-correcting because you get something like a culture of these more individually attuned AIs rather than a monolithic machine. And that helps significantly. And then thirdly, there's an empowerment of agency through this attuned, distributed interface that can interface with you and act kind of like your personal guardian because it's attuned to you and your interests, really idiosyncratic interests. And what that does is it can be empowered to interface with the global monolithic massive machines and help protect you and help enhance your agency rather than having it bleed off and siphoned off into your metadata that's being exploited and used against you. So let's just quickly review. There's individual attunement. There's a distribution into a culture of individuated machines rather than a monolithic machine. And those two together afford the third, which is something like your guardian AI that can helpfully interact in a way. And this is where Chris's work is particularly relevant. It can interact in a way that enhances your agency rather than undermining it and making you open to manipulation. So that's the basic, how I took the 3 points of the proposal. So first of all, to you, Jordan, how does that land for you? And what would you want to, what sparks in you from me saying that.
I kind of want to work backwards and put a theoretical or a principled piece here and then a strategic piece here. So, for example, if we work backwards, we could say the third point, which is the guardian AI. We're already sorely in need of something that can mediate our relationship with the info space. Already, I think, I don't know who named it thus, but things like the algorithm, the Twitter algorithm, the Facebook algorithm is already something like slow AI.
Yes.
We're already highly asymmetric in our relationship between our competency and capacity as a human with the things that are going on in the digital space, and that gap is just getting bigger. And so we will need that regardless of anything else. And then when you pour AI on the other side of that equation and not on our side of the equation, the asymmetry just gets out of control very quickly. Okay, so the principled element is to say we need something that can establish symmetry of relationality between us and the world with which we are encountering. And strategically, it seems, in fact, plausible that we can do that with something like, we've been calling it diversely distributed AI, decentralized AI, personal AI. I've been calling it intimate AI. Most recently, somebody called it soul-bound AI. So, as is always the case, we're in these points, the exact name will remain to be settled, but you get that category.
Right.
And for example, the hypothesis is that when, what was it called? DeepSeek? What was the Chinese AI?
DeepSeek.
DeepSeek. So when DeepSeek comes out, we had seen examples of this already over the past year and a half, but when DeepSeek comes out, what we get is a evidence that the power of a local AI can in principle be symmetric to the power of a large, $500 billion AI out there in the cloud, because it's just the nature of how this thing works. And that limiting factors like more rich real training data create more of a potency and utility and value than number of GPUs behind the training system. So strategically, it's theoretically plausible that an intimate AI that has access to the unique training data of a given individual's intimate reality would be able, and then also has access to all of the objective training data that all models have access to, would be able to achieve something like symmetry, in fact, perhaps an asymmetry on our behalf, vis-a-vis the infosphere, which, so then again, is necessary under any circumstances. So then moving into, I'll jump to the first one then. The idea is that the original insight was that the concept of alignment that was originally proposed way back in the early Less Wrong days, or maybe even prior to that, what was it called? Before it was MIRI, I think it was called the Singularity Institute, I think was improperly presented, which is to say, one can only have alignment with something that has a set of basic characteristics. And the way I described it was that you can only be aligned with something that has a soul, or you can only be aligned with something that has an identity, if you'd like. And so therefore, humanity as a category, as an ontological category, doesn't have an identity. Right? There isn't such a thing as humanity. It's an abstraction where we point to it and say, well, if I take the aggregation of all things that I define as human, I can categorize that as humanity, but there's nothing about humanity in terms of values, right? In terms of the kinds of things that alignment matters. I mean, we can obviously go one level lower and think of the object class of human, and then each given human is an instance, but that's not relevant to this conversation. However, by hypothesis, at least any given human could have alignment with himself, and then as a consequence, an agent, an AI, could have alignment with that human. So that's like the theoretical frame. Now, notice, by the way, I said in principle, because I think in point of fact, very, very few existing humans do, in fact, have alignment with themselves, which is to say that we are broadly out of integrity. Define that very cleanly. We do not have a properly ordered hierarchy of values. We do not have a proper mapping of our purposes to our values. And we do not, in fact, actually live with integrity, meaning that our purpose and values, the way we actually behave, expresses those purposes and values in action. So if you had all that, then you'd be in alignment with yourself. And that kind of a being has the characteristics that then an AI agent could be brought into, through the appropriate levels of intimacy, into service, into a kind of relationship with that at least in theory could achieve what we would call alignment. And so that's the first point in a broader way of saying it.
Could I just intervene at this just briefly? that seems convergent with an argument I've been making independently about right now we're aligning the AIs with intelligence, which is just a natural disposition. If human beings aren't traumatized, they have natural intelligence, general intelligence. Whereas rationality, reasonableness, wisdom, and virtue are not natural. That's, I think, what you're saying. They have to be cultivated. And not only would we would be an intimacy, we would be changing the quality of the kind of data that the AI, because it would be oriented towards reasonable rationality, virtue, and wisdom, and not just raw intelligence, because intelligence is only weakly correlated with rationality, even more weakly correlated with wisdom, that sort of thing. And it sounds like that argument I've been making and what you just said in your last point are deeply convergent.
Yeah, very deeply convergent. And it kind of brings up for me why the word intimacy is so critical. Because the other failure or the other error of the existing approaches is so interesting, because it basically it's imported the non-intimate, what would you call that? The alienated relationality that is an unconscious presupposition of our existing culture.
The meaning crisis.
Yeah,
basically.
yeah, exactly.
Yes,
It imports the meaning crisis as its axiomatics, and the proposition is no. To achieve alignment actually requires intimacy, and intimacy is a quality of relationship that is not available with something like a monolithic agent that is sort of designed to serve everybody, even if there's an effort to create a intermediation layer. So have you seen the Cthulhu, I think it's Shoggoth image that has like the little pretend face and there's a monster behind it?
Yeah.
That actually is a very good representation of what is being endeavored right now. We have something which is highly alien and highly alienated from a given human that produces a pseudo persona interface that is vaguely akin to relationality, but is impossible in principle for that to actually achieve anything like real relationality. For lots of reasons, like you can see, because it ultimately is dependent upon higher order structures in the larger centralized system. And so what you're seeing at the edge is contingent and will ultimately be folded into the bigger structures behind it, which are generalized across things that are not given individuals. So this double whammy, right? The double whammy is an orientation towards and a competence in intimacy of relationship, which of course implies a tremendous amount in terms of what do we have to do to make that both reasonable and actually functional. And then this recognition that a big part of it is to say, hey, like stage 1 through 9 is working with a given individual to help them achieve coherence, integrity, and then begin to step into maturity towards developing increasing virtue.
Oh, this is excellent. And I just wanted to, before I pass it to Chris, I just want to make sure there's one piece that I thought was important that seems to, that's sort of at the center of the second point, which is the idea with this being decentralized, you're putting in a structural, functional organization of self-correction because you have competing viewpoints rather than a single monolithic thing. And that kind of cultural self-correction is not in the existing monolithic massive machine, but you're creating not the reality, but because I take all your points well, but you're at least putting in the structural possibility of a kind of self-correcting culture, AI, that would also help to correct the asymmetry between us and the massive monolithic machines.
Yeah. So on category 2, we've got a bunch of different moving parts that are happening simultaneously. One is the proper relationship between what are now individuals, so a human and an intimate AI combination, and each other, where because each is able to have a symmetry of relationship with each other, we're now in a place of what does it look like for us to become intimate with each other, right? Which of course is now, would this be ethically prior to being able to achieve something like actual alignment with each other. So how do John and Jordan enter into alignment with each other? Well, first we actually have to enter into intimacy with each other so that we can really discern these subtle nuances of what is our participatory opportunity. Now, when the sort of kind of the deep values that are expressing themselves up are premised on things like intimacy of relationship between two human AI hybrids or combos with each other. You then get the synergy value of collaboration. Right?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
get the gradient between them in a space of free trade, we could say, or a space of collaboration produces a tremendous increase in the space of potential competence, which gives us a competitive advantage vis-a-vis monolithic training systems, like a
Yeah.
monolithic system.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
past a certain point of criticality, and it's not one, but it might be hundreds, a coalition or a collaboration or a coherent community of human intimate AI beings would begin to have a generative competence greater than even very, very, very large monolithic AIs. And then I guess the last piece would be to say, and this, and I can kind of overlay, what was his name? There was a gentleman who did a really nice overlay of Jordan Peterson's kind of historical selection function towards virtue with cognitive science and a bunch of other things. I can't remember his name.
Yes.
Well, sorry, dude.
Yeah.
You,
Yes.
maybe make a comment.
Yeah.
But that basic idea, this combination of point one and point two becomes the process or the meta process that allows, in principle, humanity to become aligned with itself. And then
Yes.
humanity to have properly a soul in the sense of the first point.
Yeah.
To be an actual identity that has a wholeness to it that is more than just being held together. So there's a lot going on there. Right? You and I have
Yeah.
talked in the past about things like how politics and economics, et cetera, work.
Yeah. The stuff the video series we did on governance, for example.
Yeah. So this activates and connects with a lot of that. So
Yeah.
that's point 1, 2, and 3. With we've done a full iteration.
Great. Okay. So thank you for allowing me to intervene. I was trying to intervene just to do a bit of amplification and clarification. And now I want to pass things over for Chris, to ask questions or also reflections. Chris, let's start to shift a little bit more into dialogos. What's sparking for you as you hear this argument that Jordan's laying out and I'm sort of amplifying?
So the first, sorry, please excuse my voice because I'm a little under the weather. So you're going to have to deal with this for the next little while because I don't have an AI at my disposal to synthesize my voice more aesthetically pleasing. Okay, that was a lot of there was a lot of things I just heard. So I think the first thing I want to do is make sure I understood at least part of it before I can respond to it properly. So this is not going to be everything, Jordan. This is going to be a piece of what you said, but I want to make sure I've got it. So this alignment problem, so we're talking about the difference between sort of the monolithic aggregated AI and then what we're calling personal or distributed or intimate AI that can map itself to a unique person because it somehow emits from and relates back to a specific person. Humanity is a far too general a category to be able to define or attribute a consistent set of features or values or virtues to. And because of that, it bucks any hope of defining it in the way that we would need to align to it. But when we're talking about individual persons, individual instances of humanity, combined with a personal or individual instance of an LLM, that's now a playing field where we can actually establish a set of coherent rules. Good so far?
Yes.
Okay. And so then one other thing you said was that, well, because each person is not necessarily aligned to himself, right? He is a scattershot array of incoherent desires, ambitions, values, virtues, behaviors, patterns of conduct that don't actually all align to a coherent rhythm because we're all kind of out of rhythm or we're all acting at variance with ourselves, right? This is like the problem going all the way back to Plato, which is that we're all apart, we're all multitudinous, we don't have a unity within that allows us to map ourselves and know ourselves very coherently. And so how then can even a personal or intimate version of an LLM align to an individual human being when he is not together in any coherent way as to condition alignment? So far, so good?
Yeah.
Okay, so then what I think the proposal was, or it was something like this as far as I could tell, which is that, well, either one version of the proposal is, well, in order to have any hope of alignment between a personalized or intimate AI and the person to whom it relates, is for that person to be brought into integrity, which is another way of saying to develop genuine rationality, to ascend from the animal to the genuinely human, we might say, and to develop something like a coherent psychic structure where the lower order and the higher order desires are aligned. And he has, at that point, what we might call in the Frankfurtian sense, free will, insofar as his higher and lower order desires are actually synchronized. He wants what he wants to want. He pursues a set of values that are consistent. He doesn't act at purposes that are crossed with his desires. And his conduct and manner of being in the world has a certain kind of, it has a certain unity. And if there could be such a person like that, and I can imagine there are a few, but perhaps only a few, then the AI would actually have something to consistently map. The question that I have then is, I couldn't tell whether the proposal was that the alignment of the personal AI. So the other thing you said was that the alignment in that case has something to do with an intimacy or a relationality that's analogous to the relationality between persons, let's say, as we are relating to one another right now in a dialogical way, where there is a reciprocal knowing of one another, there's a reciprocal modeling and mutual development. There would have to be a similar exchange between the AI and the individual person that would allow both to map more intimately. And that something about that relationality would have to be analogous to the two persons. The thing I wanted to suss out was, I couldn't tell whether the proposal was that the alignment of the individual to himself can somehow be buttressed by the use or aid or assistance of an intimate AI, or whether the alignment of a personal AI presupposes that there has been a development of the rationality or the wisdom of the person to make it possible in the first place.
The former.
I just want to add to that question. Isn't it the third possibility? Because I'm worried about an implicit chicken and egg fallacy here. Are those, what I'm asking you, Chris, just to refine your question, are those necessarily exclusive of each other?
No.
Okay.
No, not necessarily.
Yeah,
not necessarily.
I just wanted to make sure that that's not getting smuggled in inappropriately. Right.
So the metaphor that I'm noticing might be really useful here is just to think about it in terms of culture and enculturation.
Yes.
And I think it's important. I'll just posit it, right? So just let's not worry about whether what I'm saying is accurate, but I'm going to posit that it's important to notice that the forms of culture that have been dominant on Earth for 10,000 years are not at all good in producing individuals of high integrity with deep alignment with themselves. This is why it's an official problematic among the priestly class to figure out how to reproduce that. Hey, things are going wrong. We need to start thinking about virtue qua virtue and how do we begin to train that? So the fact that it's identified as a primary problem thousands of years ago is an indicator that it's not seen as a consistent solution. However, if we look back to the pre-civilized, and I don't mean that pejoratively, I mean that formally, cultures that had a much higher level of coherence and intimacy in relationship, for example, to even just their own niche and to each other, those did tend to produce individuals who had a much higher degree of internal coherence. And so a big part of the problem we're dealing with is actually that the environment, the cultures that we've been operating in are cultures of, well, to be perfectly frank, cultures of selling your soul, right? The nature of the culture we're in is one that brings you out of integrity with yourself because you're constantly having to make trade-offs of what you value vis-a-vis what your kind of the opportunities that are in front of you. And you are highly asymmetrically related to the culture that you're dealing with, and it doesn't have any degree of reciprocity. Your ability to influence that culture is very, very low. All right, so if you use that as a frame, what we could say is that with intimate AI, we're actually producing something like a microculture that is designed to be much more like the kind of culture enculturation process that is closer to an indigenous context than a modern context for an individual. And that the point being that we can say empirically that different kinds of cultures have a differential capacity and or differential result of producing individuals of higher or lower degrees of integrity over different periods of time. And so the hypothesis is that a properly constructed intimate AI would be able to provide a framework that would have a probabilistic likelihood of providing the kind of enculturation processes. And there's some very simple ones, right? A very simple one would be like, well, what are your values? And have you noticed that I've noticed that over the past week, you've done the following, 10 things. Does this align with what you actually have intended to do and with your values? Like just the simple self-reflectivity. Like there's a bunch of things that I think we can say are, let's say, objectively proper developmental processes that could be coded in that would be part of the basic structure of this intimate AI. And the feedback loop that begins to develop between the individual human and then how the AI itself begins to change its content and even in principle its underlying code begins to produce something that, how would you say, recursively moves individuals towards being just, and I think you put it just right, ordinary persons, right? To just be a person in the sense that humans can be persons.
Okay.
Fascinating. Can I hang on, John? I just want to make sure I've got this. So what it sounds like what you're talking about is you're talking about how the person is properly scaled in himself. And we're disproportionately scaled in the contrast in how we scale the way that we live with our immediate environment, what we have at our disposal, what our skills, personality, predispositions commend us to and limit us to, and the scope of what we reach for or grope for when certain, let's say, appetites, impulses, presuppositions are amplified by the noise that descends from our environment, descends from the global monolithic environment, are actually out of tune. There's actually a disproportion or an asymmetry between the container that we exist in quite naturally, the way that an average, ordinary human life is properly scaled in the body, in our immediate environment, with a limited number of socials, with a limited number of viable relationships, with a limited number of projects, with a limited amount of attention that we can naturally give to any one thing in our lives. And all of that is being magnified and thrown out of proportion by the amount of noise that comes at us from the monolithic culture that AI has given a multitude of voices. And what I think you're suggesting is something that kind of forms something like a more protective cocoon around the individual so that he can find himself on his own scale again and be known by something that is set to his rhythms, that doesn't completely cancel out all the noise, but that tunes the noise against what those natural rhythms are to try and get him back into stride with his natural rhythms. There's something like that I hear. It might not be exactly right, but
and let me blend point one and point two, because you said something that I think needs to be highlighted, and that's and funny, John, you and I are now, I get the feeling I feel like a stochastic parrot. The substance ontology, relational ontology shift is implicit in all of this.
Yeah.
Because when I say the individual, what I mean is a complex of relationships. And so, it is definitely not the case that Chris achieves a level of integration and maturity by virtue of relationship with Chris's intimate AI. What happens is, as you say, the intimate AI helps to protect Chris from the noise of the environment, but also to facilitate relationships that in Spinoza would call joyful encounters, or relationships that are conducive to the development of the conductus of Chris. And in this case, let's say John, right? So, and this is across all the diversity of relationships that you're going to be entering into, many of which are burdened just by an informational asymmetry problem. The average person who wants to go out and buy a pair of shoes is overwhelmed by the diversity of choices and the complexity of that choice construct. And by the way, usually as a consequence, has not spent any time trying to create an orientation of what their values and their purposes are. But an AI could trivially allow that to be at least clear and simple. Say, okay, here's the information space. Let's work on what you actually want to do. Cool. Here's 5 that seem to hit your values. Let's iterate on that. And the point is that what that's doing is that's collapsing the noise of the cultural space into a much more human scale set of choices that allow the person to begin cultivating relationships that are more and more and more in integrity. And then, of course, we could just, are you acting as a good friend? Are you spending time? Like all those kinds of things, which are at the level of how do you cultivate and build good relationships. In some cases, by the way, you could say therapy. Hey, Chris, I think it seems like you might want to be talking to somebody, another human who has deep experience and wisdom in this set of questions. Oh, what was it? Our noble producer who has a brand new baby. So, okay,
Yeah.
it's not intimate AI's job to give parenting advice. But intimate AI might be somebody who could facilitate cultivating a couple of relationships between you and people who are likely to be highly synergistically able to afford you deeply intimate support in such a powerful and potent piece of your becoming more and more and more of a person.
Okay, this is really wonderful. I love the way this is taking off. First of all, I want to make a plug for Spinoza. Frankfurt's notion is ultimately derived from Spinoza's, where freedom is understood as this kind of integration that affords a kind of voluntary necessity of self-determination, which is, I think, really you're motivated completely by an integrated love of the intellect, which is the noetic love of God, the noetic love of reality, and that will do that. Secondly, Spinoza is a philosopher who is very much really presciently talking about how are you part of a bigger whole, and how do you get that? Like, he's so prescient for what we're talking about here right now. So I think just the recommendation that we pay more attention to him, I think, is a good one. Now, I want to sort of throw some challenges at this emerging picture, which I think is really good, by the way. One is we touched on it earlier, and I want to lay out maybe three, and then you two we can all riff together on them. And you touched on this a little bit, Jordan, and I made sure to amplify it a bit. So we're talking about the process of enculturation, and then we face the problem that enculturation seems to require a bunch of dynamics that are not in our personal ownership or control. One is what's called credibility. We need to have role models of people we trust who do things that we don't currently understand, so that they can usher us beyond our egocentrism into a wider way of being. That's crucial to enculturation. Or else you'd have roving bands, as Jordan Peterson likes to say, you'd have roving bands of 2-year-olds. And that would be a really horrible world, right? And so where's that coming into this model? Specifically, there's two poles to this. One is there's the worldview. Enculturation depends on a shared worldview that allows for shared meaning in life that is in a reciprocal relationship with trust. And we're right, and so we've already said the worldview the current worldview is one of the meaning crisis. You said it's axiomatically going into the large models. It's like, okay, and it sounds like we need credible role models, because we have to do this even for the machines. We just use the people at whatever company as the template for intelligence. We need role models for virtue and wisdom. And they have to have a kind of teacherly authority over us, because we have to trust that they can take us beyond what our egocentric perspective says we should care about. That's how maturation works. And so that's a problem here. How do we get that into what we're talking about here? How do we deal with the fact that, we have a worldview, and I would say an understanding of meaning in life that is is incoherent. We don't properly fit in it, and this is a particular concern I'm going to raise. This notion that Chris brought up of cocooning. You see, one of the things that I find problematic about the current construct of meaning in life is it's completely individualized, it's completely internalized, it's completely subjectivized, and of course, meaning can't work that way. And that removes meaning from the domain of normativity and mutual shared self-correction, reciprocal trust and recognition that are so central to personhood. And that's what we're talking about here in some ways. And so I understand I'm not saddling Chris with a mistake, but I'm saying there's a possible misconstrual here, which is cocooning can lead. Part of what we've been doing is cocooning. We've been cocooning for a long time. We've been atomizing our lives and our meaning, and everything is down and like this, and that leads to the tragedy of the commons. And so people, they're leading lives of burnout and busyness unto death that oscillate with existential boredom. And so what I'm concerned with here is, how does what we're talking about here, how do we make sure it properly touches on the structural functional organization of enculturation, properly addressing, we need credible role models, we need reciprocal trust and recognition, we need shareable meaning in life, we need and we also need to avoid the cocooning. And then in that, how do we let the AI not just reflect us, but challenge us while nevertheless maintaining our agency and authority? We've sort of worked this out with human beings. You see what I'm worried about? The cocooning could just be an amplification of all my autodidactic biases and all of the stuff that we're already doing with social media and our home technologies and our cocooning. So, like, how do we avoid that, and how do we fit into like the needed dimensions of enculturation, which are reliable, credible role models and a properly functioning worldview? Sorry, that's a simple question for you all, but
I like the add-on, the little tag at the end, because it's like you sort of are describing an animal, like you're describing, I don't know, a pig, and then you tag an elephant at the tail. Like, wait a minute, that just got a lot bigger.
One thing that occurs to me as a question, is sort of a meta question, I suppose, to this conversation, which is, how are we, I guess this is a broader invocation of the alignment predicament, which is, how we frame the purpose of this kind of intimate AI. Is the purpose negatively oriented, or is the purpose positively oriented, for example? Which is to say, is the function of this intimate AI ultimately to neutralize the effects of the pernicious monolithic culture of AI and its capacity to overwhelm us and drown us out and magnify things about us that throw us off our own course and dissolve us in the face of our own lives? I don't even know per se if it's possible to have a merely negative orientation. But let's put aside that question for a moment. If it's functionally possible or not, I don't know. But let's say it was, for the sake of argument. Is it more desirable, philosophically speaking, and humanely speaking, to have a version of an intimate AI, a personalized AI, whose only function was to neutralize the pernicious influence of general AI?
Mm-hmm.
And otherwise, to leave us free, hopefully, to find our way on our own outside of its influence, in as much as such a thing was possible? Or does the sheer advent of it, availability of it, possibility of it, commend it to a positive orientation that must be accepted if we're to accept any of it at all, such that it is used in service for the development of the person? Like, for example, John, you talking about, well, it should not only protect you, but it should challenge you. It should not only shield you, but it should draw you out. It should expose you as much as it protects you, right? The bivalent argument about religion that you've been making following Geertz and Otto and whatnot for years, should it have that sort of two-pronged approach of protection and exposure, just as any system that orients us to the sacred does? Or is the more responsible thing, maybe the more conservative, but the more humanistic and responsible, as opposed to a transhumanistic, is, well, should AI be leveraged for personal use only insofar as it helps to protect us from its general pernicious use, and no more than that? Because otherwise we're actually straying positively into territories that are actually far more dangerous and unpredictable. And I'm curious to know your thoughts on this question, theoretically, if not functionally.
Well, I think theoretically we will discover that the more conservative approach is actually an empty set. So my sense is that what we will discover is that the problematic of endeavoring to accomplish the proper objectives of the conservative approach in the context of the actual relationship between AI and the human, and in the larger context of the inevitable arms race with the exterior, it will always collapse to something like the positive approach.
Yeah, that's what I think too. That's exactly what I think too. Yeah,
we're sort of yoked to a developmental movement, and if the AI is not participating, and by the way, now, and I mean this in the sense of participatory, like it's actually developing alongside us, so that its capacity to continue to be in relationship with us continues to develop, even as we individually and corporately continue to develop. Then there will be a terminal point where once again we'll be right back where we are, and it'll be, an even bigger problem. At least I think that's theoretically correct. Let me address a little bit of what John put out there, because I think it's what I noticed is that the way I was grasping it is I run all the way back to the preamble of the proposition that for this question to be properly addressed by any group, Sunday Labs is the example we're using here, it can't just be a technical issue.
Yeah.
It must also be, for example, the nature of how that group is coordinating. And the point is to address it properly. We're grabbing at a very, very deep level, and we're having to invert the entire context into a new form of highly connected context. So recognizing that all the pieces, everything is relevant, everything connects to everything else in some non-trivial sense, and that if you're not actually addressing a holistic approach, then you will find that it will collapse, and because of the rate and the power we're working with relatively rapidly and relatively intensely before you. So, for example, when I think about this question of models, what happens for me is I think, okay, well, this is an example. Well, actually, let me back up. Think about the question of enculturation. I can see at least three domains. The first domain is your psychological relationship with yourself, which I could say psychospiritual, right? Your relationship with yourself, and perhaps your relationship with the sacred. The second is economic. Right? The second is your objective relationship with the external environment, which includes, by the way, trees and rocks, as well as other agents out there, but operating at the objective level. And the third is the level of the intersubjective, which we could say would be the commons, or we could say would be the community, or we could say would be the church, which I argued that with Jim Rutt a couple of weeks ago. And if we notice that the default mode is to recognize that cultivating proper relationships is sort of the primary work of this intimate AI in all three of these different domains. So proper relationships with your own internal process and your own clarity and integrity, proper relationships with the choices and the agency you're presenting out in the economic domain, and then proper relationships in the context of cultivating intimate relationships with other humans. What we find is that we get this beautiful thing where the models are in fact highly distributed. We're actually, again, back to Spinoza, we're not looking necessarily for a teacher as much as we were looking for the teacherly opportunity in the encounters we're having.
Oh, that's good. That's good. I like that.
And notice what's happening. We're actually making this is the substance to relational ontology pivot.
Yeah.
And every time I think we'll notice that we just have to kind of reach into the core, make that pivot, and then look at it from that point of view and notice how that creates an opportunity for insight. I was like, oh, okay. So now what happens is that I'm surfing along basically two different, vector spaces. One is with whom am I encountering? Who am I encountering? And then the second is, and what are the opportunities for maximum joyful encounter in the context of whom I'm encountering? And these, of course, begin to reciprocate. So as my life changes, as I have a baby, there's a whole set of possible relationships that are now real that I could have had theoretically before, but they're not going to land. But now they're super present and real that begin to open up. So I begin to surface into those relationships, and I begin to notice some really complex things. Like there's the 12-year-old girl who isn't in a position to tutor me on parenting as an expert, but may have a quality of care or tenderness or intimacy with my daughter that I don't have. But when I see it, it teaches my heart something that my heart needs to learn.
So that move you made, and I just want to put a salience flag on the point, because I think it also addressed my worldview concern, which is you keep calling back to, and here I want to give some due credit to James Filler and his amazing work. The pivot from a substance ontology, and you and I have explored the argument about how that drives you into ultimately adversarial relationality or lack of relation, is a better way of putting it, versus the reality is properly and ultimately relational in nature, and how that moves you into a dialogical understanding of yourself and of the world. And I think so. I just want to point out that I think you also address the worldview concern. What I want to say about that before I bring up another challenge is this is a deep part of the vision of Sunday Labs. We're not only working on a way, a technology that more powerfully gathers this personal data, but more super powerfully protects its privacy. We're doing all of that, but we are also trying to articulate a philosophical framework, exactly like you said, both in terms of how the company is legally organized, how we practice it, and some of the things we're doing. So in addition to the tech, Chris and I are working, and we're being encouraged to do so, on the philosophy of privacy, how we have to move beyond the notion of privacy given to us by the Enlightenment within that kind of substance ontology to a relational ontology, right? And I don't want to say postmodern because that's exactly the wrong word, but past modernity, a way of understanding privacy. So I just want to point out that, of course, we are still, we're still trying to work out the bugs, both the social and the technological ones. But we have been trying to get the virtuous balance between redesigning the tech and revisioning the philosophy and the culture around it. And so I just want to I want to make clear that that's properly, and Mihir, one of the founding figure for this, has been very keen on, from the legal level outward, trying to build a different, and I'm using this word very deliberately, philosophy of orientation to technology and humanity. And so I want to put that in. That's what I was saying at the preamble. Sunday is not just this new technology and this new sort of project around it, but it's also a new philosophical vision. It's all of these, because it's trying to address all of these dimensions at the same time. And I just wanted to take this opportunity because you set it up, I think, in a really opportune way. The other thing I wanted go ahead, Jordan.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of drive home the point. We probably don't have the ability to go to a very rigorous articulation, but let me think. If you understand let me see if I could say this right. Okay, so I have to create put some concepts out there. So the basic idea that quite often, for the most part, context is more relevant than content, or form is more relevant than content. Meaning, for example, the form of broadcast television, the content of what's broadcast over TV varies, but the form has a consistency to it, so that if you engage with broadcast television over some amount of time, you absorb the implicit content of the context, regardless of what particular shows you're watching. Okay.
Yes.
The same thing is true, for example, of the form of a way that human beings collaborate with each other.
Yes.
And so the content of the form of the corporation, the startup company with a particular set of investment structures and financial imperatives and investment landscapes, is meaningful, like super, super meaningful. And this is the key assertion that I want to make. And the problem that we're trying to solve, right, this deep problem of how do we actually properly integrate the power of AI into the world in a way that is not only non-catastrophic, but is in fact actually good, cannot be solved by any corporate structure, any entity that is governed by the formal constraints and the incentive landscapes of an ordinary tech startup.
Yeah. Yes.
So it's not kind of an aesthetic or trivial, like this is neat. This is actually from a design point of view.
It's essential.
It's essential.
Yeah. I agree. It's not accidental. It's essential. That's very helpful, Jordan. I want to pick up on the response to Chris about, because I agree with it, about that ultimately the positive is sort of unavoidable. It's necessary, but I want to problematize it a bit. And this is slightly orthogonal, but I'm trusting that between the three of us we can make it more properly land. If we allow it to challenge us and afford our aspirational growth and not just protect us from noxious interference, then we have the problem that not only does it have to align with us, it has to have something which I find very problematic philosophically, which is it has to have some alignment to normativity itself. The true, the good, and the beautiful. It has to care, and this is perhaps part of what's behind Chris's concern. And on this side, I agree with you, Chris. So I'm trying to say I think it has to be positive, but here's the problem with the positive, which is, for reasons I've articulated. I did it again in the UK. These things are not living. They're not autopoietic. They don't care. They don't actually do relevance realization. They're parasitic on ours, and there's all kinds of argument and evidence for that. I'm not going to review all that argument. Jordan, you're well aware of these arguments, and Chris is too. And the idea is, can we get them? Do we need to? Sorry, I'm really trying to get this precise. Can we get them to care about the true, the good, and the beautiful? And I've been arguing for a fourth transcendental, the true, the good, the beautiful, and the meaningful. Can we get them to orient towards that? I don't think the current machines can, even these individualized ones, but is there a proviso such that, but we can get them to do something close enough in this context that it will be good enough, right? So there's two questions. I take it that, like, if it's going to challenge me and it's not going to be robbing my agency, it has to share my commitment. This is a Kantian argument. If it doesn't share my commitment to the true, the good, the beautiful, and the meaningful, then when it's correcting me, it is merely imposing on me in a demonic way, right? And it can only really teach me, correct me in a Socratic fashion, if it properly cares about, is oriented towards the true, the good, the beautiful, and the meaningful. I don't think these machines have the ontological capacity for that. Is that ultimately a crushing problem? Because at least you and I, Jordan, have agreed that the positive thing is kind of the inevitable. So the argument I'm making is I agree the positive is inevitable. The positive seems to presuppose an ontology these machines can't have. Is that a devastating problem? That's the nutshell.
I in real time have concluded the answer is no, it's not a devastating problem. You want to see what came up? Check this out. This is pretty fun. So the first image I had was a scaffold, like the kind of thing that in my case, a mason would use to help build a wall. And the question was coming through my mind is like, okay, well, that's definitely just a dead architecture. There's nothing about it that has something that could vaguely be thought as cognitive, human cognitive. What would it look like for me to articulate the word care? Like, how would I think about that in terms of care? The next image that came up for me was I had three in rapid succession. The next was two hammers, one of which was a poorly manufactured piece of shit. The other one was actually an instrument of hammering nails produced by an artisan who cared. And then the third was I had a Stradivarius violin. Okay. And so I was like, okay, what are these images telling me? And what landed on me was...
I just want to intervene for 1 second. I continue to enjoy your phenomenology so much.
Yeah. Okay. I'm glad. In this case, I also do too. Because it was fun. Like I could actually notice like a feeling of, yeah, that's quite beautiful. Like I was guided by the beauty of it and the landing of, to the degree to which we are guided by these transcendentals, in this case, beauty, I think for the most part, in the cultivating and the crafting of the tools. This is like, I'm making almost a very profound McLuhan sensibility, right? This relational ontology does not end at the human. That the tool is an expression of the tool maker and it's expression of the tool user. And so if I put my heart and care into a tool, an instrument for the purpose of delivering something of value into the world, a canvas, a paintbrush, a musical instrument, it's an extension of my care, right? And so what happens is if we recognize that we are glued to these things, it's not a series, it's not me and the AI. Rather, the AI is itself an expression of the actual embodiment of the soul of those who put their care into its production, which over time becomes intimately entangled with my own.
Okay, so I think I want to address the ontology backwards from what you just said, because what sparked in me is, Jordan is invoking extended cognition, much like Hutchins, who navigates a ship, a bunch of people and a bunch of technology actually orient the ship properly.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is we could form like a distributed cognition, right? That in the distributed, not in the machine on its own, but that distributed cognition has the ontological capacity to care, and then that distributed cognition can correct me, John, the individual. Am I getting you right?
That's it. That's exactly right.
This is good.
That's exactly
right.
Good.
This is a good answer. I mean, to my mind, because I'm a 40 cognitive scientist. I want to shut up because I want to give space for Chris here, because Chris, everything I've been doing for the last little bit was trying to pull apart my ambivalent relationship to your proposal. And you saw the two parts. I agree with Jordan, the positive, and then I thought what the ontological problem was that I thought you were putting your finger on. And then he's given, I think, a powerful response. So where does all this land for you?
The truth is, I don't know.
That's good. That's a good truth.
I feel very ambivalent. I mean,
but just to be clear, it's not that he knows that. He just has it tattooed in the back of his hand. It's like,
I do.
Right. Hold on.
But I can
base case.
Periodically say, I don't know.
It says, when in doubt, choose form response.
Yes.
I think. So, I mean, my first response, somewhat mirthfully to the question, would have been, yes, it's a devastating problem. That doesn't mean it's insoluble. It does seem rather devastating, if not insoluble. I do like the response, though, that you've given, Jordan, and I think that I'm sympathetic to. I mean, I would have to be working on the project in the first place, clearly. So there is some intuitive belief that this must be done. As Mihir likes to say, what's necessary must be done. I do believe it must be done, because I think that the alternative is untenable. And I do like the idea, and I find it very plausible, that the tool maker, or the set of tool makers, if they, between them, have a communion of purpose, can imbue their tools with that communion of purpose. And if they fit their tools with the proper pedagogy, the surrounding culture and learning, limit its use responsibly, and create the fabric of how best to deploy it, and have that fabric be interwoven with the affordances of the technology itself. Can this be done? Yes, I have to believe it can. Not only because it's a sound argument, but because it's the hopeful one. And in this situation, the virtue of hope and hopefulness actually seems like a very wise and appropriate thing to have on hand, because it's very, very easy to catastrophize this. And it's very natural to catastrophize this. And when perhaps this is the slight creeping in of the theological disposition, when I say this, but in the face of the catastrophizing that has many, many, many sound pieces of evidence fortifying it, the hopeful response is perhaps, dialectically speaking, the wisest one. So there is something about this that rings true, if only intuitively and not always logically. But there is something behind it that has the unmistakable tone of truth. The other thing, yes, John, I know you're wanting to jump in. What go ahead.
Oh no, I just didn't. I wanted to point out a potential final thing, but which you just touched on. You mentioned the theological. I do think there's another fourth thing here that's been implicit. I did want to bring it up just before we run out of time. There is an improper, and there's already serious academic reflection on this. There's an improper religious response to the LLMs already emerging, which I've already mentioned. And this is what I sometimes mean about how theology is the science of the future, given what's happening to us. And I want to say that there's a fourth, and I'm not sure if it's completely a fourth point or if it's just sewing through the other three. But I think this has the potential to save us from idolatry, the project we're talking about here, to save us from the worship of the LLMs, save us from displacing, because of the hunger of the meaning crisis, our religious needs onto these machines. And I'm not being farcical here. This is happening, and it's happening to an increasing degree, and it's going to happen. It's going to happen, I think, at a non-linear rate of increase. And so I think this proposal, what Sunday Labs is doing, how we're unfolding it, also has the important role, and I don't mean to sound overly biblical here, but neither am I allergic to sounding biblical, of protecting us from idolatry, which is a pronounced and pernicious thing that can really harm human beings. I just wanted to put that out before we lost that, because you flagged it and then you were moving on, and I didn't want it to get lost.
No,
so sorry for intervening, but I just wanted to put that fourth point out there.
No, I appreciate that. I think that's good. And I actually think that there's a relationship between privacy. Sunday Labs is tremendously focused. You and I are tremendously focused. The work of Sunday is profoundly focused on privacy, and you and I are trying to figure out, what is this privacy business and why does it matter, right? After working for years in public policy in relation to privacy, nobody seemed to have an answer for the question of what is this and why does it matter, beyond protection from the state, which is a little bit of an outmoded idea of what privacy is for. Not completely irrelevant, but incomplete. And no one seemingly had understood what the philosophical foundation, what is this for? We have the sense that it's important. Is it a virtue? Is it virtue adjacent? We have the sense that somehow human life, such as it is in this time, requires this, and yet none of us can figure out what it actually means. And yet all of our laws and policies and whatnot presuppose that it's real enough to be a concept we all reach for, and something desirable. Okay, why is that? And what you just said, John, makes me think that, that protection from idolatry and privacy are deeply related to one another.
Yes.
What are the things that protect us from idolatry? One of the most profound protectors from idolatry is intimacy.
Yes.
The sacred is discovered by way of intimacy. And it is discovered by way of the kind of intimacy that happens in the silence of knowing that cannot be named or codified. Right? We find, and to use very, very specific religious examples of this, or sacred examples of this, right? You find privacy in meditation or in meta-contemplation within the chamber of your reflective space. You certainly find it sacramentally in a confessional booth if you're a Christian. You find it within the sanctity of a sangha, right? Or the people that you read with, or the people that you pray with, or the people that you keep as close discussants, or the people you confide in when you don't know who else to confide in. There is something about intimacy and vulnerability contra exposure that produces shame and unannounced harm. The act of being vulnerable and to be intimate, the disclosure of oneself and the disclosure of the world that happen coterminously when one disposes in vulnerability, are made possible by privacy, because privacy is the thing that keeps vulnerability from becoming exposure.
Yes.
It keeps it from becoming invasive. If you do not have privacy to have a free and frank discussion, or to disclose things that are so shamefaced that they can't possibly be aired in the open, you're much more likely to be idolatrous, right? What do totalitarian states do? They suppress private, frank candor. They suppress intimate relationships that could actually bear truth on their wings. So there is this powerful, powerful connection, I think, and this is something that we'll have to flesh out another day. I have only its intuition, but this occurs to me very strongly, that something about the protection from idolatry, I'm trying not to use the word cocoon, but the space or the field of play that privacy operates within, and the intimacy and fundamental relationality is the ground of what is true and real in our lives, are all deeply related concepts. And if we can somehow provide for a technology that enables and affords these things by its very nature and its very design, then we will have done a world of good.
Well, I think I would articulate it this way, not to in any way say this is exhaustive, but just to keep it the momentum. I think we've had a lot of uh, you know sort of horizontal notion of privacy, our relationship to ourselves and to each other in terms of like a wall between us and other people. Um, but I think you're right. That was ultimately in relationship to a vertical notion of privacy, which is the relationship to ultimacy in some sense. Um, and that's why I posed the question to Jordan, because I was worried about if the machines are going to have a positive, meaning corrective uh, affordance of our aspiration, that vertical dimension is already present, and it has to be properly explicated and recognized and homed within what we're talking about here. And so uh, I think that's properly right. I think because privacy is about the self, and the self not only has an aspirational relationship to the future self, the self has an aspirational relationship to the higher self. And those both have to be incorporated into a notion of privacy. And I've talked about this. This, by the way, gives you some indication of what Chris and I are doing as we're trying to get past a much older and largely obsolete, although it has necessary components in it, but the whole picture is necessary obsolete of privacy. So I hope that at least, Chris, I'm not trying to replace what you said or your intuition. I'm just trying to share how I've understood the intuition with you.
Are you ready for my response?
Yes, very much.
All right, here's my response. I would love if somebody, Akira the Don comes into my mind, but somebody of that sensibility would go back and cut the piece that Christopher just laid down and then provide it back as its own track with the appropriate kind of music behind it. And then we would need to have like a little sign that says, at this point in the conversation, pause, go to your favorite chair, pour yourself your favorite beverage, sit down, maybe with a fire, something like that. And then just listen to this 5 or 6 times. That is my response.
That's good.
That is very generous, Jordan. Thank you. Can it be whiskey?
In my case, or maybe bourbon.
Okay.
So I think we can, is it sort of fair to say that that fourth point deserves to be added to the 3 that we've already discussed? And that notion of at least the 2 dimensions of privacy wrapped up in it. So I think that's been well articulated. So I think we've gone through the 4 points very well. And I think I was pleased. There was a lot of sparking and catching fire, which I liked, mixed with some very careful, precision of thought, which is a good marker that we're getting into something properly Socratic. And I thought it allowed us, without having to get into the nuts and bolts of the technology or other things, it allowed us to present what we're talking about when we're talking about the Sunday Lab project. We're talking about powerful new technology. We're talking about a new way of organizing a company, an organization around it. And we're talking about a much broader philosophical framework that can help really fundamentally give us a correction to the asymmetry that now exists between us and the emerging AI, potentially AGI. And so this is, and to pick up on Chris's lyrical point, this is not only plausible, it is a hopeful response that can make a real difference. And it's not something that's just vague out there. All of this is in production at all these levels, the technological level, the organizational level, the philosophical framework level, all of that's at work. And so I'm just going to end by, first of all, asking first Chris and then Jordan to give final reflections. And I'm going to thank both of you for this excellent discussion. Chris, you first.
Yeah, thank you both. I don't know that I have too much else to say just because this is like going to be an ongoing roaming conversation. So I just consider it to be one long discussion in installments. One thing that just occurs to me is that I'm just grateful that this much care and rigor and thoughtfulness is being devoted to this, and that we're being given the time and space by Sunday, between ourselves, by one another, that we're affording the time and space to think this through carefully. There's so much haste. There's so much like breathless haste in this field and in this, I don't know, this sector of life, however we want to term it. There's so much of this forward propulsive momentum, and it becomes very easy to slip and slide across it. So one thing I just cherish is to stop and slow down, even if it doesn't feel like we can afford to, even if it doesn't seem possible to stop and slow down, breathe deeply and think deeply and wonder and call everything into question. And I feel relief that such a thing is still possible between us. I know that Sunday has been a big proponent of it. I'm grateful. I'm just grateful that we're doing this. That's what I'm left with.
Thanks, Chris. Jordan?
Well, in terms of background, I've been looking at this problem for, golly, about 20 years, to be honest. Like, this question of AI and alignment has been out there, and it's been something I've been contemplating. It's been, how do I say, highly likely that we would be where we are. Not certain, but highly likely. And one of the things that I began to notice over and over again was that the approaches to trying how to solve the problem weren't working, and that a deeper dive indicated that they couldn't work. And that we're now sitting in a circumstance where, as you very specifically articulated at the beginning, the ethos is one of either, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. We're gonna win the game theoretic arms race, or just try to go hit stop, which is neither of these are actually even real. At the end of the day, they're not actually real perspectives. But I think we are talking about what might actually be a viable solution. And I don't know if it's able to be heard strongly enough how powerful that possibility is. And like in this little conversation, we may actually be articulating at least the beginnings of what is an actual plausible design specification for what human AI alignment looks like, and how that can actually be delivered into the world in a time frame that matters, like relevant to now. So this is a bat signal from my point of view. And I hope that a lot of people, particularly people who are very deeply interested in this category, pay close attention, and then I hope that it's very helpful.
Thank you. And finally, our thanks to Sunday Labs, to Mihir for his leadership, for the whole fellowship. That's what we call it at Sunday Labs. And also thank you for considering to watch this video. This is one of the most pressing issues of our time.